Our next speakers will talk about the importance of universal design to ensure accessibility for all citizens, but especially for persons with disabilities. Kristi Avalos is the President CEO of Accessology, Inc., a national organization devoted to assisting businesses and governmental agencies in the practical applications of Americans with disabilities regulatory compliance. Kristi played a large role in helping the city of Tulsa develop its ADA transition plan and has provided several ADA training courses for local professionals. Joining her will be Dave Roberts. Dave is the Vice President and Director of Planning for the engineering and architecture firm of Craft & Tool. Dave and his planning team are currently working with INCOG and Tool Design Group on the GO Plan, the Tulsa Area Bicycle and Pedestrian Master Plan. Dave has a unique insight into built environment access issues as the parent of a 13-year-old daughter who has cerebral palsy and is confined to a wheelchair. Dave's understanding of universal design comes from living it as a parent with a special needs child, as well as his view through the eyes of an urban designer. Please help me welcome Kristi Avalos and Dave Roberts.
Well, good morning. All right, one thing I didn't expect to say here that after listening to the previous speakers, I can say ADA is the answer to a lot of your problems. Usually I get up in front of the room and I say, you know, I know everybody hates ADA, but I have to do my thing. But the truth is, ADA is an answer to a lot of the problems. We're going to talk about sidewalks and street crossing and curb ramps and accessible Ped signals and all of the requirements that ADA provides. But the thing that is important to remember is that ADA is 24 years old this year. That means next year's 25th anniversary. You know what the disability community does every mile mark? They file cases. They celebrated the 10th anniversary of the signing of ADA by filing about 600 cases nationwide. 20th anniversary, almost 1,200 cases. Next year's 25th, and they're going to celebrate from January to December. Okay, so we expect landmark litigation next year, and if you think about it, if everybody had gotten on board with ADA 24 years ago, we would have a lot of the issues resolved at this point. Okay, so it was signed in 1990. I was on the White House lawn that day. I have been doing disability issues since 1977. And I have even been fortunate enough to be able to write disability legislation for the country of Peru. So there's nothing new to me here. So I want to go over some of the myths of ADA as well as some of the requirements that just don't seem to have gotten into the right slot the way that they should be, mostly to help you understand what your responsibilities are, what your opportunities are, and how to protect yourself from this ever-increasing ADA litigation. So the first thing I want you to understand is that ADA is an employment-based civil rights law. It's not a construction law. Because there are construction elements to it, it is important that you meet those construction elements, but it is an employment-based civil rights law. It was to get people with disabilities into the workforce. That was the whole purpose of it originally. Okay, now, you are, those of you who are in the design world, you are to design for everybody. And the thing about accessibility is it works for everybody. Okay, accessibility works for the moms that are pushing the strollers. It works for everybody. It is not just for those people, as people like to refer to them. It is for all of us. Okay, everybody uses the accessible features. And ADA does not require you to put in sidewalks. I hear a lot of municipalities going, oh, we can't afford to do this. Oh, we can't afford to do that. The truth is you can't afford to do it wrong. You can afford to do it. You make a decision as a municipality or as a Title II entity whether or not you're going to install sidewalks. All ADA says is if you install them, make them work for everybody. That's all it says. It doesn't ever say that you have to have a sidewalk. Just if you have it, it has to comply. Now, where they have to be compliant. And in order to get them compliant, there is a requirement to have a transition plan done. Okay, Deb mentioned that I help with the City of Tulsa transition plan. That's primarily what we do. We're working on the ODOT transition plan right now. Okay, the problem is the transition plans were supposed to be done back in 1993. If the transition plan had been done back in 1993 for all the municipalities in the country, at this point we'd almost be done with bringing everything into compliance. But most municipalities, not just here in Oklahoma, but everywhere, are just now starting the transition plan. Okay, it is a requirement, and it's the first thing the Department of Justice will ask for if they come knocking. It is the very first, well, no, it's the second thing. The first thing they'll ask for is the ADA coordinator. The second thing they'll ask for is the transition plan. Okay, so looking at the pedestrian facilities, ADA and the new upcoming PROAG document, which stands for Public Rights of Way for Accessibility Guidelines, those two documents talk about 3 different types of pedestrian elements. There's sidewalks, there's shared use paths, and there's shoulders. Okay, pedestrian access route is for pedestrians only. Your trail pedestrian route is going to be in your hike and bike trails, and there are further regulations coming out to help with outdoor developed areas and things like that. And then there's your shared use paths, which are both pedestrians and cyclists. So let's talk about some of the important elements. First of all, there's cross slope. Now, let me help you understand that a person who uses a wheelchair, especially if they've had spinal cord injury or spinal cord involvement, they don't have balance. A lot of times they don't have front to back, they don't have side to side. If they start to tip, they cannot correct themselves like we can. Okay, so the cross slope is an important safety element, not just the government telling you have to do something. All right, it works for people with disabilities, and it is not a requirement just in new construction. As a matter of fact, the law, and a lot of people understand the standards but not the law specifically says accessible routes have to be maintained in an accessible condition. So that goes to the question that was asked earlier. So there has to be a maintenance schedule that says, okay, we're going to be maintaining these things as we go. The maintenance team needs to be trained to understand what is a danger. Now, I mentioned the cross slope a minute ago. I have now been on 5 death-related ADA cases. I can't remember if I mentioned that I do ADA expert witnessing. 5 death-related cases, and 3 of them were sidewalk issues. 1 was a cross slope issue similar to this. Okay, we had tree roots grew, the sidewalk tipped. There was an 11.4% cross slope. She hit that. It tipped her over. There happened to be a fire hydrant right there. She hit her head and it killed her. Okay, this is more than just a good idea. This is more than just enticing people to walk. It's a safety issue. Okay, ADA is all about making everything that you and I want in life available to people with disabilities. It's the whole purpose of it, including jobs. Okay, another thing about cross slopes that we have to pay attention to is going across drive aprons. A lot of times when we go across drive aprons, there is no, they haven't done anything to reduce that cross slope, okay? There's been no preparation. Now, your running slope can follow the slope of the street. That's how places like San Francisco and Colorado exist. Okay, it's okay for the running slope to follow the slope of the street. It can't be steeper than the street. If you meander it off to make it look pretty, well, then it needs to comply. But if it's just following the street, you can't get a slope less than 5% on a 12% street any way you try. And so they recognize that. Now, a big thing that came up in PROAG, and that is also in the new ADAG standards that came out in 2010, is addressing the counter slope. Okay, once they come down off the slope, if they hit a counter slope that's more than 5%, it can flip them backwards. You're going at a pretty good speed, that can be a real problem. So you got to maintain the counter slope, and where we often have a problem is when roads are resurfaced. Roads are resurfaced, we now are causing a level change to get from this curb ramp to that curb ramp, and that can be a problem not just for people in wheelchairs, but for people who use canes, crutches, walkers, people with visual impairments. So these kinds of things have to be maintained, and they have to be paid attention to from the design As a matter of fact, one of the things that often confuses me is why urban planners don't get involved in the transition plan. The two go hand in hand. All a transition plan is a master plan for accessibility. The two should be done together. That's the first thing that I try to get involved in when I start working with a municipality is, what's your master plan? Okay, so another problem with counterslopes is if they have wheels in the very back, they can get caught. So that's often a problem as well. Now, surfacing is a big deal. The standards say it has to be firm, stable, and slip resistant. It doesn't say it has to be concrete. However, you have to consider the users, and that would be all of the users. The smoother and more free it is of level changes, the easier it's going to be for people using any type of mobility aid. Again, not just wheelchairs, canes, crutches, and walkers. All of the mobility aids are affected by little bitty level changes. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the route that we intend for people to walk on versus the decorative elements that we want to have. Okay. This type of surfacing is very rough for somebody in a wheelchair. It's even worse for people who use walkers, especially the elderly. Okay, it can cause them to trip. It can cause broken hips. All kinds of problems. Now, the surface, again, doesn't have to be concrete. In this particular case, well-maintained and well-installed brick is going to work. Firm, stable, and slip-resistant is going to be something that you want to achieve. And a lot of surfaces, like crushed granite with a bonding agent, work just as well. There is a document put out by the U.S. the U.S. Access Board that is acceptable, accessible exterior surfaces. It's an empirical study of all the different types of surfaces and what does and doesn't work in your exterior environments. So if you need that, make sure you contact me. My email address is going to be at the end of the presentation, actually the end of Dave's presentation, and we'll get you a copy of it. Now, detectable warnings are very important for people with low or no vision. Okay, we used to have curbs. Curbs used to tell somebody with no vision that they were about to step into a vehicular hazard. And now the curbs have gone away to provide access. So if you think of the truncated domes as curb replacements, they are required to be at every place you don't have a curb. Okay, in your main public rights of way. So that tells somebody with low vision, the color differential tells somebody with low vision that there's a vehicular hazard, and the texture differential is enough to tell somebody who is visually impaired that there is a vehicular hazard in front of them. The grooves, saw-cut grooves and things like that, they're just not detectable underfoot. So the truncated domes are the only things that are now accepted in all 50 states, and that's what we need to get used to using. Okay, but again, they have to be maintained. If you're using a brick paver and they get worn down really easily, they have to be replaced. Because if somebody walks right into traffic and there is an accident and that texture differential was not provided, that would be an ADA violation. Okay. They're required at all street crossing, railroads, transit stations. You have to put them, you know, before somebody steps into the subway, we want them to know that there's a hazard in front of them. Okay, so you want to think about them as a deterrent. People who are visually impaired are going to be well aware of when they recognize the truncated domes that there is something in front of them that they need to be cautious of. The whole purpose of them. Okay, there are a bunch of different types. Like I said, brick pavers are certainly allowable, but brick pavers are they're more expensive to maintain because they do wear down, and where the elements are an issue when you're plowing over them and things like that, they tend to get broken really easily. So you want to be careful in what you choose for your truncated domes. Okay, they're only required to be 2 feet deep. The old standard, and some people put them the entire width of a curb ramp, that is not required. It's only 2 feet at the bottom of the curb ramp. Again, as a curb replacement. That was an agreement between all the different user groups because people in wheelchairs, people using canes, crutches, and walkers had a hard time walking across a big patch of them. So if they're just 2 feet at the bottom, it's enough to warn somebody with a visual impairment, and it's enough for people who are, you know, walking to just step over them or get over them pretty easily. Okay, these are just the dimensional requirements for your truncated domes. They're very, very distinctive in design, and that is by design. That's because they need to be providing that warning. They're a safety element. Okay, they're very specific on how you can install them. Okay, again, if you're thinking about it as a curb replacement, then in some circumstances, they're going to go right where the curb went. But if your grade brake breaks 5 feet before you actually get to the curb, then they're going to recommend that you put them, I don't think this is working. There it is. They're going to recommend that you put them where they will warn somebody before they get into the actual vehicle route. Okay? I know a lot of this isn't new. But I just kind of wanted to go over some of these major features for you. Again, if you have some kind of an island, you want to make sure that they're telling somebody who is visually impaired where both sides of the island are. Okay, they're not required if the island is less than 6 feet wide, because they would be right on top of each other. But I still recommend them. And understand this, just because they're not required certain places doesn't mean it's not smart to put them there. You always want to look at things from a liability standpoint. I see a lot of ADA design more as risk management. I do a lot of risk management when it comes to not only what is installed, but where it's installed and when it's installed and where is your biggest risk. Okay, it really does form or fall into risk management. Okay, you have to have them at pedestrian rail crossings. Okay, if you've got sidewalks that go across rail stations, you've got to make sure that you're warning somebody with a visual impairment, again, before they go across those. Now, your pedestrian crossings are very, very difficult. They have determined now that 3.5 feet per second is really what you need. But you got to remember, if you've got somebody who's visually impaired and they're pushing an accessible Ped button, for instance, they've got to go over and push the button, then they've got to reorient themselves to where they were. Sometimes just doing that, because the button is way over there and up over that curb, sometimes just reorienting themselves uses up all of that time. So in areas where you know you are serving more people with disabilities or a large population of people who are elderly, you want to make sure that you are designing in accordance with the population, the primary population that will be using the space. Okay, your pedestrian crossings are just a continuation of your pedestrian accessible route. They have to be able to get from point A to point B. So putting in a curb ramp on one side when it leads to absolutely nothing doesn't do any good. It's about connecting so that somebody can get from point A to point B. Well, this is what we're looking for everybody in a walkable community. And therefore, again, ADA becomes more of an answer than it does a problem. I think for far too long, people have looked at ADA as this big evil law that the government is making us do. But the truth is, it answers a lot of the questions and serves all of the population. Okay, just other pictures of pedestrian crossings. Now, they don't tell you when you have to mark a crossing. Okay, usually I recommend crossings are marked because of liability. It clearly tells somebody in a vehicle that there's a possibility of pedestrian traffic. MUTCD does give you some guidance on that. Okay, the maximum crosswalk cross slope is 2%. Always shoot for 2%. There are now some circumstances where you can go up to 5%, but just because you can doesn't mean you have to. All right, if you can get 3%, get 3%. The only time it's ever allowed to be up to 5% is a street crossing that has no stop or yield control. Okay, so if they're crossing a street there, then you're allowed to have up to 5%. But again, if you can get less than 5%, that's what you want. So don't ever go to the maximum. Pedestrian crossing needs to be easily located for wayfinding, especially at things like roundabouts. Pedestrian access route has to be separated by curb. It gives you a continuous detectable opportunity for people to know where their path of travel is. Okay. Now, accessible Ped signals, kind of a big deal. We see them all over the country. Put where you and I as able-bodied people are going to go over here and we're going to step over the curb and we're going to find it and we're going to push it. But it has to be on an accessible route. It has to have a level landing area in front of it so that somebody in a wheelchair can get to it and push it. It has to be within reach ranges. It has to be within 10 feet of the curb ramp itself. There are some requirements as to where it needs to be. This is from MUTCD. You want to make sure that we're putting them where they're usable, not where they're convenient. And here's the one that a lot of people don't realize. You've got a 10-inch reach from the side to where the button needs to be. So that 10 inches is often forgotten. So you've got your accessible route, you've got your 30 by 48-inch level landing area, and then you've got your button. Those things all have to connect. Okay, a lot of the municipal lawsuits that we've seen have been over this issue. So it's something that you really, truly want to pay attention to. Okay, the face of the button has to be parallel. As a matter of fact, there's a raised arrow on it. You want to make sure that you're telling people who have low or no vision, or people who have cognitive impairments, exactly what direction that button's for. If they've just got a couple of buttons, they don't know which way it's going, it's going to cause confusion. So if you've got an arrow that clearly says you're going this way and the other one clearly says you're going that way, that's going to help orient somebody who has low or no vision. Additional features, the locator tone. If you've got the audible tones now, those are very helpful for people with no vision. So, and they can adjust based on ambient noise so that they're a little bit quieter at night, that kind of thing. And then the transit stops are the last thing that I'm going to talk about. There are requirements for bus stops, bus shelters, transit stops. They've got to be on an accessible route. We don't want to encumber that accessible route with newspaper stands and street furniture and planters and things like that. There has to be a place for a lift to deploy. Okay. That's what it needs to look like. So you've got your bus shelter. You've got your pedestrian route, you've got your boarding and alighting area. That's an accessible bus stop. Okay, sticking a bus shelter on, the side with a nice cover and no route to it is not compliant. Okay, we have to make them work for everybody. Now, I know sometimes it's tough. This is a little town right here in Oklahoma that it had challenges. Old town, big challenges, but they did it. It takes thought, it takes time, it takes money, but it can be done, okay? And like I said, if this was on a transition plan in 1993, for all of the conditions that you have in a municipality, by now, most of them would be resolved, okay? The transition plan is a required document, so if you don't have one, you absolutely want to make sure that you get one in place for those who aren't right here in Tulsa, because Tulsa has one, I know. All right, now the disability minority is the only minority that can be discriminated against by the built environment, okay? That's a big statement. It's also the only minority that doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, it doesn't matter where you live, how much money you make, any one of us can join it at any time. And when you consider those two factors, life changes. You think about it differently. The disability community actually calls us TABs, temporarily able-bodied, because if you live a normal life expectancy, you will have a disability to one degree or another at some point in your life. So we need to embrace ADA. We need to recognize that it is for everybody, not just those people, but your aging family members. It works for everybody. And it's time. It's been, the courts are getting really impatient now. They're saying, hey, you've had 20 years. They're going to look at how much money have you spent in those last 24 years. And could you have done a better job by now? So people like to call it an unfunded mandate. The truth is that It's how you use your funds. If you receive federal funds for safe routes to school, and you're not making those routes accessible, it's just misusing the funds. That's a decision that somebody makes. So you get these federal funds, and you use them to improve your walkability, your rideability, but also your accessibility.